from the campus of the University of Pennsylvania Wharton School. This is Knowledge at Wharton on Business Radio. Here's your host, Dan Loney.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to Knowledge at Wharton here on Sirius XM 132, Business Radio powered by the Wharton School. Thanks for spending part of your day with us. It is the 23rd of May as we come to you from Philadelphia. A little bit of a cloudy day. Hopefully you're enjoying the start to your day wherever you're listening to us around the United States. And welcome to our friends up in Canada. Coming up on today's show at the top, state governments are trying to help eliminate student loan debt. Many are now offering deals to help eliminate that debt by working in sectors that are tough to hire people in. We'll discuss the ideas that are popping up around the country and if they are working. Then in about 30 minutes, we talk to the authors of the new book, Pivot to the Future, which looks at how companies need to adjust to the changing landscape of their business because of technology. Then in hour number 2, Washington State, the first to approve human composting. It's taking a dead body and letting it compost instead of being buried or cremated. We'll discuss the process and have reactions to it. Then in our final 30, tipping, once again an important topic. How much do you tip? Who do you tip? A recent article by CNBC has drawn criticism because it was suggesting cutting back on tipping. We'll discuss where tipping is today, coming up at 11:30 Eastern Time. All of that over the next 2 hours. Your comments and questions are welcome throughout. The way for you to join in is either by phone at 844-WHARTON, 844-942-7866. Or if you'd like, send us a comment on Twitter at BizRadio, B-I-Z Radio 132. Or you can use my Twitter account, which is at Dan Loney, L-O-N-E-Y 21. First, though, here's what you need to know from today's business headlines. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, in an interview today on CNBC and heard on Sirius XM 112, stated Huawei does, in fact, work with the Chinese government, despite their denials. He added that Huawei's work with the Chinese Communist Party puts America's information at risk. Sales for electronics retailer Best Buy beat projections last quarter. The big box chain saw a 1.1% increase in sales with revenue of $9.14 billion. L Brands, the parent of Victoria's Secret and Bath & Body Works, beat earnings last quarter. Same-store sales at Bath & Body Works rose 13% for the quarter instead of the 5% decline posted by Victoria's Secret. It also raised the lower end of its full-year forecast. Weekly unemployment claims dipped by 1,000 on a weekly basis to 211,000. Meanwhile, the 4-week moving average, which eliminates some of the volatility in the weekly data, was down almost 5,000 to near 220,000. Various reports out of the United Kingdom say that Prime Minister Theresa May could resign within the next few days. She has faced a backlash over the last couple of days after announcing a new Brexit plan. And medical device maker Medtronic beat Wall Street estimates last quarter with profit of $1.54 a share, revenue beating projections as well. States are trying to lure college graduates to fill their labor force by offering to pay their student loans. The programs are aimed at filling various high-need professional positions that differ with each state offering these programs. The jobs range from medical staffing to teachers to farming. Student loans obviously have become a major issue in this country, as an estimated 2/3 of undergrad seniors are in debt. Nationwide, there is a $1.5 trillion worth of student loans on the market. That's why this benefit of loan forgiveness is getting more attention and becoming a draw. Joining us to discuss this, Carl Van Horn, a distinguished professor of public policy and director of the Heldrich Center for Workforce Development at Rutgers University. And also with us is Christopher Peterson, who is a law professor at the University of Utah and a senior fellow at the Consumer Federation of America. Carl, great to have you with us today. Chris, great to talk to you again.
Good morning,
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Dan.
Thank you. Carl, I guess let's start with some of these ideas that are being brought by states. And again, as I mentioned at the top, they will vary from state to state depending on the needs that are out there.
That's right. I mean, what this reflects is two trends, which you talked about. One is the mounting debt that young people have, on average almost $30,000. And certainly if you are going to a private university could be way over $100,000 of loans that are non-dischargeable. You have to pay them back somehow. So that is a huge burden, and young people are looking for a way to ease some of that debt. The other trend is, as you suggested, it's the chase for talent, especially in the so-called STEM fields, perhaps others as well. It may be in physicians, primary care physicians, and so on, to try to get people to move to their communities where they're having difficulty getting people to come there and render services or work in companies that are demanding that kind of skill set.
Chris, you're being there in Utah, and Utah is one of the states that is involved in this. 25% per year for every year that people will work in some of these areas in the state of Utah. How is that playing out to this point?
Well, I think it's a breath of fresh air that states are trying to start to address the problem instead of just waiting for reform in Washington that never, ever seems to come. But that being said, I think we have to be a little bit realistic about the size, the scale of some of these programs. So you mentioned the program in Utah. It's currently focused on technology graduates, and they're estimating that it's going to affect about 90 kids, 90 students per year. And,
right.
And the total overall allocated budget is $2.5 million, which is, look, I mean, there are $1.5 trillion in outstanding student loans and 44 million Americans that are in debt. This is a nice gesture. It's a nice program. I don't want to, suggest otherwise. A breath of fresh air again, but not anywhere near the kind of scale that we need as a society to start making significant progress on this crisis. The
proverbial drop in the bucket, I guess, would be the best way to say it.
It's a nice drop, though. So
it is.
That.
It is. So then, Carl, I'm in playing off of what Chris says. What type of size are we talking about for some of these programs around the state? $2.5 million is obviously a good commitment by the state of Utah, but as is suggested, we have a much larger crisis on our hands.
That's right. I mean, but it's an example of two things. One is I think the states are signaling, they're trying to send a message to people that they're welcoming. They're also responding to the cries of the business community for a shortage of skill sets in a particular area. So that's part of it. And the other is it's simply a way of saying, hey, let's experiment and see if these things work and try to build some momentum so that when and if the federal government's ready to act, they can demonstrate some progress. So, states cannot afford to solve the $1.3 trillion problem. It wouldn't be that big anyway if we just talk about certain STEM fields. But it's a signal. It's a message. States are always figuring out a way to compete economically. And so instead of perhaps large tax incentive to companies, they're figuring let's put some of that in the pockets of young people if they decide to move to the state and remain here and work in a company.
So I guess the question is also, Carl, if you have these graduates that are making this commitment, as I alluded to at the top, the hope is that they would be able to take this commitment over what period of time it might be, 2 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever, that commitment period, but then also that they will have, to a degree, built roots in that state and maybe start to develop a long-term life in that state as well.
Right, and even if it just to get them to think about a place they might not go to. So a lot of folks will perhaps migrate to some of the mega cities in the country, but if you're in a rural area, let's say, Maine. Maine has a great difficulty getting primary care physicians. It has an aging population, so, they need doctors to move there. Doctors have very large debts. This is a way to try to attract people. Other states may be trying to send a message, hey, we're really in this field of technology and STEM. Why don't you come to our state and check it out? So, as I said before, I think part of it is symbolic. And for those who benefit, obviously, it's a great opportunity. But I think states are desperate, really, to chase this talent, and this is a reflection of that desperation.
And Chris, obviously, one of the other things that we have talked with you in the past about is the long-term debt and how people, in many cases, are saddled with it. And here's an instance, potentially, that can show a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel for some of these individuals.
Well, that's true, and it's a positive development. I think that it's going to help some people who are in fields that are particularly high in demand within various places around the country. But the scale of it is relatively small, and I think it also, in a certain respect, distracts us from the core problem of some of the core problems that we're not dealing with. So, for example, the servicers that are collecting student loans, federal student loans for the federal government, are chronically underfunded and mismanaged, and are not helping consumers get the kind of existing federal programs that are much, much larger in scale and can have the potential to affect many millions of more people. So many students qualify for income-based repayment plans, but can't seem to manage to take advantage of them because they can't communicate with their servicers in a way that makes it effective for them to transition into programs that better affect them. Just another example, the federal student loan program that forgives debt for people that work in public service jobs after 10 years. So the first cohort of consumers that qualify for this, or that thought they qualified for this, have now reached that 10-year milestone. But less than 1% of the people who have applied to have their debts forgiven under this program have actually been approved, because the maze and sort of bureaucratic nonsense that has been erected by the servicers hired by the federal government has made it virtually impossible for people to take advantage of this program. And these are people who are not necessarily in the highest demand fields, but are our teachers, our post office workers, construction workers, the people that have ordinary, I suppose not construction workers, that's not a public service job, but point being that the thing that we need to do is address the core problem, and that's something that's really just not happening in Washington right now.
Carl, your thoughts?
No, I agree. If you broaden out the conversation, it certainly underscores the bigger issue. And this is a story often told. There are many benefits the government potentially makes available, but people have difficulty finding out about them. The income-based replacement is certainly a good example. In New Jersey, here, our state higher education assistance authority is making a very aggressive effort to inform people about what is available to them, trying to push up the numbers there, because that is absolutely a critical message. But again, like many things, people don't know it's available, and it gets to the whole even larger question of why do students take such large loans in the first place to go to schools that are very expensive that don't necessarily pay off. So the whole issue of what people buy, what they're getting in return for their investment, is on the prevention side. How do you help people make better decisions about the return on investment to them and what the implications are? Many students, for example, don't even know that the letter they get from a college that says, "Hey, congratulations, you're admitted, and here's what's going to cost." It's not clear that part of that is a loan. And this is another issue about transparency in the whole business. So there's a lot of things that need to be fixed. We're talking about this little angle on it, which has to do with loan forgiveness in particular areas of specialization. But as Chris said, it's a much, much larger issue.
Well, Chris, what would be some of the things that maybe we need to really start to consider to make a bigger impact on that $1.3 trillion number? And obviously, with a number that big, I don't know if you can do something. Well, you certainly can't do it overnight. It would be hard to do it within a month or a year, maybe 2 years. But what needs to be considered at this point when you're thinking about the debt itself?
Sure. Well, it's a complicated problem. I'll give you a couple things off the top of my head. First, we need to try to have reform of the student loan servicing industry to make sure that consumers are getting the programs that they're entitled to. Second, we've got to rein in the for-profit schools, who are the worst of the worst in terms of the quality of education they're providing. They're also extremely expensive schools, even though very little of the money that consumers spend on these proprietary trade schools actually goes towards education. A huge portion of the tuition revenue that they collect sponsored and funded by the United States government, really just goes to promote marketing and advertising, not actual teaching, and certainly not research or scientific invention. And the other issue, and that leaves hundreds of thousands of students every year going out into the marketplace with enormous student debts and very marginal credentials that don't serve them well. And the other issue that I think people lose sight of, that aren't paying attention to what's happening in Washington, is that the for-profit schools have enormous political power because they dedicate so much of their resources to lobbying, to building relationships with legislators on key committees, both at the state and the federal level. And until we rein in the for-profit student loan programs the for-profit schools that take advantage of our student loan programs, it's going to be very hard to come to terms with how to better structure those student loan programs to serve more mainstream and reasonable institutions like our community colleges, our junior colleges, and our research universities as well.
Carl?
Yes, I don't disagree with what Chris said, but I would just add that we have to get to the larger question of wherever you're going to college or community college, what's the actual ticket price? What is it going to cost, and how much money you're borrowing? And to help strengthen the advising process for young people and their families when they make those critical decisions. This, by the way, starts in the high schools, which often are overwhelmed by the demand for assistance. Counselors really often are just reduced to helping people fill out their forms for financial aid. So that whole counseling process, both at high school and then even entering college, I think is flawed. And so we need more transparency. We need more assistance. So that's on the prevention side, basically so that we don't continue marching up that large number so that it becomes $2 trillion, 10 years from now. So, this is a big issue, and I think it's one that when you look at polls, Americans generally are very upset and very concerned about this. They have the aspiration to go to college, have their children go to college, but they don't really know how they're going to be able to afford it.
We're joined on the phone by Carl Van Horn of Rutgers University, Christopher Peterson of the University of Utah. Your comments are welcome at 844-WHARTON, 844-942-7866. Or if you'd like, send us a comment on Twitter at BizRadio132 or my Twitter account, which is at DanLoney21. We're talking about the variety of states that are putting into play student loan repayment programs as long as you get those individuals to come work in that state in various fields. Again, 844-942-7866. Or if you'd like, send us a comment on Twitter at BizRadio132 or my Twitter account, which is at DanLoney21. Carl, in terms of the states that are doing this, obviously we've mentioned Utah. You mentioned some of the issues that are up in the state of Maine. But the dynamics of the states themselves that are doing this, how much of this is in part to try and draw people to come to work in those states in general? Obviously, the student loan piece just being a part of it.
That's right. It reflects the larger question about how do you build up the workforce, especially in states that have an aging workforce and they're not, the young people are leaving to go somewhere else, so they want to keep them there, or they want to attract people there. So you'll see in many states, for example, all sorts of what I would call millennial-focused strategies, including not loan forgiveness, but also other things like building up amenities. In other words, increasing the density of brew pubs in certain communities. Literally, there are places that talk about that to make it more attractive for young people to be there, creating more recreational opportunities, developing urban walkable communities so that people don't have to have a car. So there's lots of things states are trying to do, and this is a serious business for them because if they want businesses to locate there and expand in their states, they need to make a welcoming place for younger students, younger graduates, who are looking for a different kind of environment than people in my generation look for, which is, a house in the suburb and a two-car garage. So this is just part of a larger picture. And it also, as I said before, it reflects the fact that now many, many states understand that the key to economic development, beyond the usuals like, tax policy and regulations and infrastructure, is really talent. How do you attract and retain talent so that you can attract business?
But Chris, there also have been cities out there that have been trying a version of this, and some of them have been offering a straight cash incentive to people, or a version of it with living expenses to come into their particular cities as well.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there definitely is. One of the strengths of our country is the way that we compete with each other, and fosters innovation, and we create, areas in the country that are developing new products, new services, and attracting talent. I think it's overall positive, and I agree with everything that Dr. Van Horn has said about that. I do worry a little bit, though, that some of these programs tend to be targeted towards some of the students that maybe, need help maybe less than those that are worse off. I mean, for example, primary care physicians in Maine, great example. It's something that's a real need. It's going to serve a lot of people who are, not getting good health care. But what about the folks that get a trade school degree that doesn't have a lot of value, and after they rack up thousands and thousands of dollars in student debt are still waiting tables or working at a low-wage, minimum-wage job, and see no end in sight because their loans are not dischargeable in bankruptcy, and there are no programs that are available for them because they're not the person that the state is trying to attract. I worry a lot about them, and I do think that there are some exciting proposals on the horizon to try and address those. For example, Senator Durbin from Illinois recently introduced a bill to change the bankruptcy code. It's a simple bill, and it just says let's treat student loans kind of the same way we treat other sorts of debts. If you can't pay them back and you can declare bankruptcy and write down some of that debt, that's something that would really make an enormous difference in the lives of millions and millions of Americans. And really, in a certain sense, it's a fairness issue. If our businesses can declare bankruptcy, if ordinary families that aren't facing student loan debts can declare bankruptcy, why not folks that have tried to get ahead by getting an education but have not managed to succeed in doing so?
844-942-7866, or if you'd like, send us a comment on Twitter at BizRadio132 or my Twitter account, which is at DanLoney21. Carl Van Horn of Rutgers University joining us, Christopher Peterson of the University of Utah joining us as well on the phone. Again, 844-942-7866, or if you'd like, send us a comment on Twitter at BizRadio132 or my Twitter account at DanLoney21. Carl, Chris brings up an interesting point that I want to touch on, is the fact that the qualifications for individuals actually being involved in these programs in different states and making sure that people that truly are saddled with debt and maybe in fields that are in lower income paths actually have the opportunity and can qualify to be a part of these programs.
Yes, I mean, they're obviously not income-based programs. These are programs based on the qualifications that are in demand in that particular state or community. But of course, the students that do not fit that particular slice also need to be helped. And there's another issue which we've kind of alluded to but haven't really focused on, and that is, I think Chris was probably implying this, the students who go to schools, whether they're private or public, and they don't finish. So these are students who have the worst of all possible worlds. They have a large debt, but they have no credential or no degree to show for it, which means they're even less likely to be able to pay off that debt. And there's a very large number of people in this country who are in that situation. So for whatever reason, they're not able to finish, and it usually has to do with life circumstances rather than the fact that they're not ambitious or diligent. And those folks in particular ought to be able to have their debt forgiven, because I agree, I think Senator Durbin's bill is a particularly interesting one, because in the large scheme of things, we have to find a way to help relieve the burden of all these folks who have this enormous debt. It's changing their entire life. They can't afford to buy a house. They're either not having children or delaying having children. There are many things, moving back in with their parents. These are all things that have an enormously negative effect on individuals and families and even on the communities they live in.
In your opinion, Carl, then, can the universities themselves do something as well to help this process out?
Well, I think the role of the university is, as I alluded to before, one, be absolutely transparent with individuals when they come in as to what that final cost will be and how help them think through how they're going to pay for that so they're aware of that in the first place. And then secondly, making sure that they do everything they can to help them finish, and give them the support they need. And lastly, give them the best information they can about what the labor market pretends for them in the future. So what I mean by that is if you go into a child care services, which is a great thing to do, but it's not going to pay you a lot of money.
Yeah.
So understand that before you enter that major.
Chris?
I agree with everything Carla has said. Those are all great points. And in addition to that, I would also add one more. I think that our higher education system needs to start focusing on maintaining, lowering our costs. Not just universities, but also junior colleges and community colleges. Community colleges, I think, doing the best job on that of keeping costs low. We need to make sure that we have broad-based access, and that means that we need to hold the university administrators accountable to, keeping costs down for the students and focusing on the things that are truly the most important. There's a real tension with the way that students act sometimes. Many university administrators are focused on trying to keep the rankings of their schools up high, and that often means attracting top-level talent, a lot of bells and whistles in their educational curricula. And those are good things, but the problem is that there's very little that holds university administrators accountable for keeping costs low, since students oftentimes primarily follow the rankings of universities. So we need to do a better job of working in their best interest to keep costs low.
You mentioned Senator Durbin before, Chris, and the bill that he is trying to move forward. But I would think just as important would be various state legislative bodies trying to bring initiatives forward as well, Chris.
I think that's true as well. I mean, states have a lot to add here, and again, these programs that we've been talking about are a real breath of fresh air. One that I don't think we've mentioned that I particularly think is great. North Dakota has a student debt forgiveness program for teachers and designated subject areas that are underserved. I mean, that makes a lot of sense to try and give some debt forgiveness to get teachers up there into North Dakota to make sure that the kids have educational opportunities at the primary and high school levels. But that being said, states have some great things that they can do, but over 80% of the student loan debt in this country is
federal,
owned by the United States government.
Yep.
The federal government has the primary levers of power on this, and it's the federal government that is ultimately going to be responsible for helping shape the destiny of the 44 million Americans who are trying to pay back their student loans.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time today. Carl, Chris, all the best.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you,
guys.
Thank you. Carl Van Horn at Rutgers University, Christopher Peterson at the University of Utah. We will take a break. When we come back, we will be joined by two of the three authors of the book Pivot to the Future. From Accenture, Omar Abash, Paul Nunes. The book talks about how companies need to make that pivot because of technology so that they can be successful in the future and not get left behind. We'll talk with them next. Sirius XM 132, Business Radio, powered by the Wharton School.